so much for coming, everyone. My name is Emily. I work for the Scapa State Watershed Council as the nursery and project manager. And one of the biggest things we deal with, this blackberry's in love with me. We deal with a lot of weeds. I think that's probably one of our biggest project management tasks we have to deal with, just because creeks and water systems unfortunately lend themselves to be really good sites for invasive species, because once plants get introduced into an area, you can have a flood water or creek water coming through, and it washes the seeds or it washes the plants down into the system. So today, the library was gracious enough to invite me to speak about common weeds we see in our watershed, and also offer up some solutions for how to combat them, some suggestions for what you can do to try to mitigate or prevent them, and just a little botanical information as well. So because we've got some interest in this beautiful specimen here, I'm going to present our first plant, which is Tansy ragwort. Tansy ragwort is a pretty common species. You see it a lot in disturbed areas along the roadsides or in pasture fields. It's got these beautiful bright yellow flowers with long petals and these very soft, kind of curly leaves. They can get very tall. This is probably about as tall as you see them normally, but I've also seen them in some areas where they were very small. This is a plant that is toxic to livestock, so it's not something that you want horses or cattle eating. I think
You wouldn't want your pets eating it either.
you know, I could check with my partner because he is a veterinarian. My understanding is animals really shouldn't be eating this, period, but it's more concern for horses and cattle because of the way their stomach kind of digests things.
Since we have a little dog that eats anything. Anything. A walnut falls, he's gonna eat it. A leaf, yeah, he's into everything.
Oh dear, please keep him away from the tansy ragwort.
Yeah, that I'm concerned.
So, one of the ways that we try to control tansy ragwort, it is being controlled by a biological agent. Some years ago, they released the cinnabar moth caterpillar, which is where this plant comes from in Southeast Asia. The cinnabar moth, to my understanding, is the natural insect that would keep its population under control. So sometimes you'll see little black and orange caterpillars crawling all over the plant. And that's great. If you have a tansy plant that has all the caterpillars, don't even touch that, because we want the moth to basically continue doing its job to try and reduce the population. But generally speaking, when we run into this plant in our project sites, there's a couple of ways that we will go after this. We will use a type of herbicide that we call a salmon-safe herbicide, because the chemicals have been designed so that when they come into contact with water systems, they're not harmful for the fish. So in this case, we might use something called Vaxlan, which is a broadleaf herbicide selector. We would try to spray this plant during the early spring when it's just starting to come out. It hasn't formed a flower yet, because if we're using herbicide, we want to make sure that we get the plant before it starts to go to seed. But if you're not interested in using herbicide, one thing you can do is you can either try to pull or dig up the plant. Sometimes if the soil is really soft, you can get the root system pretty decently. If the soil is not so great, what I might recommend doing is either cutting the plant at the top, right about where the stem starts to meet the leaves, and then you can either try smothering it with some canvas, some tarp, and just try to kill it that way. Otherwise, digging it out is going to be your best option to kill this plant. And like tansy ragweed, there are other plants that we see in our watershed council that have those beautiful, distinct appearances. I have a feeling that this is a pretty common plant for most of us here. This is called poison hemlock. It's in the carrot family, and it's related to yarrow and Queen Anne's lace. But one of the main differences is you can see that it gets very tall when it reaches its 2-year stage. And it also has these big, white, frothy flowers. I think it's a very beautiful plant because it has these beautiful red speckling, which helps to make it stand out from some of the other carrot family members, but unfortunately this plant is toxic. What my understanding is that you have to eat a lot of it as an adult in order for it to kill you, but it is toxic to small animals. It's definitely not good for kids to eat. And there's some members of the carrot family, like giant hogweed, where the sap will actually cause burns to your skin if it gets exposed to the sunlight. So when we deal with this plant, our goal is to try to target it when it's in its first year stage. So this is a biennial plant. It's gonna take 2 years before it starts to flower. And when you see it as a biennial form, it'll basically just look like leaves sticking out of the ground. That's the best time to take care of it because once it gets to this stage, it's gonna have a better chance, it's gonna have released seeds into the environment, so you're not gonna have as much effect trying to get rid of the plant as you would if you went after it when it was in its first year stage. And the way we normally go after this plant is if it's in its 2-year stage, we'll probably mow it down. We'll basically take our weed whackers, wearing all the proper protection we need to make sure that the bits of plant don't get in their face, and we'll cut it down just to knock the flowers off. It will regrow, so you have to follow it up with some type of chemical treatment, or you have to be willing to dig up the root system afterwards. It's usually easier to go after it in the early spring when it just starts to send its leaves out. And that's when we'll either hand pull it if the situation calls for it and we don't want to use chemical means, or in some cases, we will select a salmon-safe herbicide for the site. And the reason we try to do the salmon-safe herbicides is because our project sites are along creeks and streams. We want to make sure that if any herbicide gets into the water system, we're protecting our fish populations as much as possible. Does anyone have any questions about the poison?
Well, no, but like digging things up and stuff,
Yeah.
or we have so much clay soil here that's as hard as a rock. It's hard to just dig them up, you almost have to go for the chemical part, don't you, in a lot of cases?
Yeah, that's where, if you're dealing with a lot of clay soil, I would almost recommend chemicals are certainly going to be the most cost-effective solution. You could potentially try cutting off the stems and covering it with layers of like tarp or mulch and cardboard, but it's really going to depend on what's going to be the easiest for you. If you want to invest a couple of seasons just letting the cardboard and mulch do their trick, you can definitely go for that. Otherwise, herbicide might be the best solution. So the 2 plants that I just showed you are what we call Class B weeds. The Oregon Department of Agriculture basically has a list of plants based on how invasive they are or how recently introduced they were. These plants, the tansy ragwort and the poison hemlock, have been in the environment for long enough that they're what we consider Class B or Class C weeds, where they're priority weeds in the sense that we don't want them proliferating on site, but they're also so commonplace that there's not going to be endless amounts of manpower and resources spent trying to control these plants. That's a different story for our garlic mustard, and you can actually pass this around. Garlic mustard is what we call it's considered an early detection rapid response plant by a lot of different soil and water conservation districts. This plant, unfortunately, it's a major problem for some of the water systems throughout the state of Oregon. We have it along our North Scappoose Creek and South Scappoose Creek. And this plant releases a chemical into the soil that makes it impossible for other plants to grow.
Now what's it called again?
This is called garlic mustard.
Garlic mustard.
So if you take the leaves and you kind of crunch it up in your fingers, you'll kind of smell like garlic. And I these just because they're in an area that we've been actively treating for garlic mustard, but there is a cocktail recipe out there where you can make garlic mustard cocktail. And I've also heard people use it in garlic mustard pesto. This is a first year form. When it gets to be in its second year stage, you start to have it go up into a long, tall stalk. It'll have small white flowers. And unfortunately, the seeds can last for 10 years in the soil, is what I've heard. And that's one of the reasons why the Soil and Water District, as far as I know, has been actively treating in some areas for 10 years, but we're still finding pockets of garlic mustard in our water systems because the seeds are constantly getting brought down from other sources, and unfortunately they're lasting in the soil for a very long time. So this is one plant that we will look at targeting either with chemical method or with manual removal. Sometimes the rosettes are pretty easy to pull up, and as long as you can get the entire taproot, I definitely recommend hand pulling in some cases. Unfortunately, sometimes the situation doesn't allow for that, especially when we've got a large distance to cover and we don't have a lot of time and manpower. So we'll select an herbicide like Vastlan, which is great for targeting broadleaf plants like this, or Garlon 3A, which is another broadleaf selective. And we'll try to spray the plant when it gets to be in this first year basal rosette stage. We recommend trying to control the plants when they're in their first year stage because then you save yourself from having the plants go to seed down the road. And out of curiosity, have you guys seen this at your properties?
You've been up in field more than anything. I think you guys came out and did some on ours.
Okay, that might have been the Soil and Water District, but that makes me really happy that it was only a small number of people in the room here.
Maybe, but it could be something else.
If that's true. There are some plants that look a lot like garlic mustard. We have people sometimes mistake violets for garlic mustard just because when the violets, because of the leaves, yeah.
That'd be a really big violet.
It would be a really big violet. The key way to recognize garlic mustard is these big kind of heart-shaped leaves that are a little bit scalloped. But as you can see, sometimes the leaves can be a little bit different. So your best bet, for me at least, is to crunch it up because usually there is a distinct garlic smell, and that if you're walking around, you just start smelling garlic. That's when it's like, all right, I'm either eating somewhere where someone's cooking something delicious, or there's garlic mustard here. Yeah, but this is a plant that we're trying to help the Soil and Water District try to control and eradicate, and yeah, we're hopeful that we'll be able to do some good work soon.
Grow in clusters together.
They do. So a lot of the times you'll see them in big groups where you'll have like a bunch of smaller plants grouped together, and they'll kind of like spread themselves out over a patch. And then this is Japanese knotweed. Yeah. Japanese knotweed is a very interesting plant. It evolved in volcanic areas, and because it basically grew in volcanic areas, it developed the ability to self-propagate with any small piece of the plant. And that's one of the reasons why it's horrible for our water shed, because anytime a small piece of the plant breaks off, or you have leaves and root systems getting washed away because of high water, you end up with plants just going into new areas faster than you can try to keep up with them. They're a beautiful plant. They're very distinct to see because they have very tall arching stems, and they also have these very big, this one's a little bit dried out and crinkled, so you're not really going to see it, but they usually have their kind of spade-shaped leaves. And the stems are, I've heard some people describe them as bamboo, but they're they are reminiscent of bamboo, but the key thing is they tend to be more curved and arched, whereas bamboo is straight up and straight down. This is a very difficult plant to eradicate. And unfortunately, there really are not a lot of good mechanical options for mechanical removal because you have to dig out the entire root system, and unfortunately, some of the root systems can be feet in terms of length, like 4 or 5 feet wide in some cases. So this is another plant where we typically do a combination of mechanical removal and herbicide application. We will either spray the young plants with an herbicide, or in some cases, the recommendation is to cut the top of the plant off just about where the plant touches the ground, and you spray the inside of the cut stem with the herbicide. This plant requires a very strong, we call it a prescription, which basically is a mixture of herbicides. So our go-to herbicide is either rodeo, and some companies will use Mazapure. We'll probably use rodeo for our next knotweed treatment just because it's what we have on hand, and it is one of the herbicides that we consider as our salmon safe herbicide. But unfortunately, you have to have a very hot mixture. And by that I mean a lot of ounces per gallon of water in order to make sure that you really kill the root system. And this is a plant where if you're removing Japanese knotweed, you have to keep on top of it because the thing that can happen is you may get some of the stems, but there could be little nubs or rootlets that grow up further down the road. So I made a reference earlier to weed management being a little bit like having a child. This is one of those plants where you're committed to the long term when it comes to controlling them.
Are those stems stiff enough that they're semi-erect, or do they lay on the ground?
They're usually very erect, and that's a great way to recognize them in the winter because they're deciduous, they will lose their leaves. And so if you see a lot of slender, kind of erect arch stems, that's usually what knotweed looks like. We see this plant in a lot of our creek systems. North Skeptis Creek is one of the areas that I'm familiar with as being a very heavy infestation for knotweed, but this plant also likes disturbed areas along the railroads and along the Columbia River too. So it's one of those plants where, because it's so pervasive, it's not always easy for us to get funding or successful control work, but they are doing experiments with a type of weevil. There's a weevil that will eat the Japanese knotweed, and I know at least one watershed down in the Willamette Valley was doing experimentation with releasing the weevil into headwater sources, so that theory being that the weevil would make its way downstream and hopefully eat the plant. I don't know enough to say whether or not that's successful, but I can also say that the weevil's probably going to be similar to the cinnabar moth, where it's not enough to eradicate the plant completely, but it might help control it and just keep it under control enough that we can do our best to manage it in other areas.
The weevil isn't gonna eat a bunch of other plants on its way to get to this one.
They've done, there's always that chance whenever they release a new pest into the environment. I know they do a lot of testing and a lot of experimentation to make sure that any insect they do release into the environment is not going to jump into another species, but that is one of the things that we have to be careful of, and it's one of the reasons why, as much as I'd love for there to be more bugs taking care of the weeds for us, there also is that reality that we have to be careful of the other native species as well. So one last plant that I consider part of the early detection rapid response plan is knapweed. So knapweed is this beautiful plant, and you guys can pass it around and take a look. You may have seen it with a beautiful purple flower in the late summer. This is knapweed. There's two kinds that have been seen in Oregon, meadow knapweed and spotted knapweed. To get down to which one is which, my understanding is you really have to like count the number of bristles on the head of the buds or some like tiny minute detail, which,
Oh,
you know, I love keying out plants and trying to identify them, but I'm also, there's too many things for me to do to really be sitting
yeah,
down,
it's a
so.
fair count that.
So, knapweed's not native, and unfortunately, in the last couple of years, I've started seeing this plant more and more along our creeks and along the railroad systems. So we think part of what might be happening is, if you look at the seed heads on your plants, there's a lot of, the seeds kind of have these really bristly layers to them. And we think that when people are mowing along the sides of the railroads or along the sides of parks and roadways, unfortunately the seeds are getting transported into different areas. And probably when the plants also go to seed as well, there's creeks and rivers that are carrying the seeds further downstream. This unfortunately is something that the Soil and Water District has been battling for a while, and we ourselves are actively trying to help the city of Scappoose manage knapweed on a few of the park areas. We're seeing, I can't say whether or not we're seeing a lot of success because it's too early for me to say yes or no, but this is a plant that we're going to be actively trying to control for the next, for the next few years until we really start to see a difference. For us, this is another plant that you can dig it up when it's small. You can manually remove it through digging it up, but generally we try to wait until late summer, which is usually, so May to late June is when you can spray it, because at that point it hasn't started to put out flowers just yet, and you have a better chance of the herbicide doing its work. Now, I have a feeling that if I show everyone this next plant, everyone's gonna have an immediate sense of what this plant is. This is our beautiful English ivy, and unfortunately, English ivy is a very common pest on many of our creeks, water systems, and projects. As you can see with my hands right here, we have these beautiful stems, also called rhizomes, which spread across the ground very easily, and they grow very fast. I don't know how many feet per day these plants can grow, but they can grow very quickly. And unfortunately, they create these very thick, dense layers on the ground that smother a lot of native shrubs and understory plants. And when they get up into the trees, that's when they can actually become a hazard for trees, because they will, in some cases, strangle the trees.
Right.
This is one plant where, I love to get the community involved because you can manually pull it up. It can be tricky trying to get all of the stems and runners, but I like manually pulling it up when it's on the ground, because if there are like flowering plants or beautiful ferns, you have a chance of removing the ivy without killing the native plants underneath. But there are some cases where, in project sites I worked on in the past, there was just so much ivy that we had to do a lot of spray treatments to try to control the plant. This is another plant like Japanese knotweed, where if you have to use herbicide, you have to use a very strong mixture of rodeo in order to make a dent. And it's generally recommended, for me at least, that if you are going to do a spray treatment, to manually clear any shrubs or trees you want to protect, because if they're underneath the ivy while you're spraying it, there's a really good chance you will maybe make the ivy look a little bit brown and wilty, but the plant underneath will be dead as a doornail. When the plant is growing up into the trees, we generally recommend doing what's called air gapping. So we're going to pretend that this vine is growing up a tree, and if I was looking at a tree the way I would want to kill the ivy is I would want to cut off at least a foot or 2 feet of the vine from the ground to where it's going up the trunk, because that way the ivy that's growing up in the canopy will die and will have a chance to safely crumble and decompose, whereas if I just start yanking on any vines that are going up into the tree, I have a good chance of damaging the tree or potentially hurting myself, because there could always be dead limbs and broken branches. But when you do air gapping, where you cut off the lower section of ivy, you can actually make yourself have a really easy job, because then you don't have to worry about the trees. The ivy will eventually die and crumble away, and you just have to worry about the stuff that's on the ground as well. So I just want to pause and give people some time and space to ask any questions, or to ask if they want to hear a little bit more about some of the plants I just mentioned before we move on to our next couple of species. Okay. You know, this hemlock is kind of like a dance partner you don't want to be dancing with. So one thing I wanted to do tonight was I wanted to talk about Himalayan blackberry, and if I can find him, the table kind of got a little bit messed up, our native blackberry. So there are a few different kinds of blackberries that we have here in Oregon. The most common one we see is the Himalayan blackberry, which unfortunately is a big problem for our creeks and water systems, and pretty much for all of our natural areas as well. It's a very tough, woody perennial plant with deep roots that can spread pretty easily via underground and top ground canes and rhizomes. You can recognize it pretty easily because of its prickles and because the leaves only have 5 leaflets. But our native blackberry, which is also called trailing blackberry, probably because it kind of likes to meander and wander over the ground, they look pretty different when you look at the stems. The stems of the trailing blackberry has this kind of milky, glossy color like what you see on apple skins. And their leaves only have 3 leaflets. The other distinction I like to make between these plants is that the trailing blackberry has little tiny prickles, whereas this one has big fat thorns. I consider trailing blackberry to be a good plant to have on a project site. If it's becoming a problem, such as it's clambering over and onto native plants and it's smothering them, that might be when I cut some of it away just to free the plants underneath, but I typically leave it alone. Himalayan blackberry, on the other hand, because of the way it grows, it doesn't form good root structures, and it unfortunately crowds out a lot of our native shrubs and other plant species that could really benefit wildlife. So this is a plant where you can manually remove it. However, there's not always as much success. This report I have read says that if you consistently cut the blackberry several times a year for multiple years, sometimes you can eradicate the blackberry that way. It takes time, and unfortunately the root systems are always going to be alive underneath, so there's a good chance the blackberry might come back. Some studies have said that shade seems to be really good at suppressing the blackberries because they don't grow as vigorously in the shade as they do in open, sunny, disturbed areas. But ultimately, for us at the Watershed Council, we do a combination of cutting and herbicide treatment. We will go in the summertime, so around July this time of year to about late August, to cut the plants, because that gives us a window of time where we can let the plant grow back so it has leaves, and so that in the fall, around September or October, we can spray the plant with a broadleaf selective herbicide it's really important to time any herbicide treatment you do for blackberry because if you do it in September or October, the plant's gonna be getting ready for winter dormancy, so it's actually taking the nutrients from the leaves into the root system, and you have a better chance of killing the plant, killing the root system. Of course, you still are gonna have to come back for a couple of years to really keep at it because there's always gonna be seed sources. Blackberry is part of the native ecological community, I feel, and while there are times where I do wanna manage it and eradicate it from some project sites, I also recognize that we're not gonna get rid of it completely at this point. And the nice thing about it too is that in the places where, it's in like a roadside median, you are able to have a healthy snack in the plants. We have a few more plants that I wanted to introduce to everyone because I've seen them on several of our project sites, and I have a feeling that some of you may have seen them as well. This is bittersweet nightshade. This is a very small bittersweet nightshade, but if you go out into the creeks, like if you go out to Veterans Park, and you see these gray, viney plants with dagger-shaped leaves, and they smell like a tomato plant when you crush them, that's bittersweet nightshade. That's a pretty bad plant to have on project sites because, like ivy, it just really takes over, and unfortunately, it can choke out a lot of native plants. And we actually have so much nightshade growing in one section of the creek at Veterans Park that I don't think the water is flowing very well, and so I have to spend about 4 to 5 hours and 8 to 9 trash bags pulling those plants out of the creek. It's one of those plants where you can remove it by hand. It does come up pretty easily in most cases. You have to make sure you get all parts of the plant, unfortunately, because if you leave behind little bits of stem or little bits of roots, it will come back. It has beautiful red berries, and birds, unfortunately, really love those berries, which means it's very easy to spread. So my recommendation is always try to remove it before it starts producing purple flowers, because if you can pull it out by hand and get rid of it before the fruit comes in, you might have an easier time in the long run. And last but not least, we have this beautiful bird's foot trefoil, which is a member of the bean family. It has small yellow flowers that look a little bit like a sweet pea flower almost, and it's called bird's foot because it has 3 to 5 leaves kind of arranged up at the front like a bird's foot. That's one of those plants that it's not listed as a priority weed, but I'm seeing it on a lot of our project sites, and I feel that it's probably something that's coming up and down our creek systems as well. And that's a plant where we'll either manually remove it or we'll spray it with some herbicide. All right, and I want to open the floor up to questions. If you have questions about plants that you've seen on your property, or if you have questions about any of the management that could be done for these plants, I'd love to be a resource for everyone here today. And
What's this one here?
oh, that's a cool one. This is wild cucumber, or another name for it is man roots. I love it personally because I think it's just such a wicked wild plant.
Yes.
And unfortunately, this is another plant where it just grows really quickly, and it has very long, deep root systems. So this is one where it just takes over, and I'll make the call if it's in an area where we have native plants or we have areas that we want to protect to remove it, either by hand pulling it with a lot of frustration because the root systems are so deep, or by spraying it if the situation calls for that. But it's a very difficult plant to get rid of because it grows very quickly, it has very deep root systems, and it has these monster seeds, which I'll actually show everyone. Doesn't it kind of remind you of like that
Oh,
scene
wow.
from Alien?
Yeah.
My dad calls them splatter bombs.
Splatter bombs. Oh my god, I love that name.
Yeah, they collected when he was a kid
Huh.
and had splatter bomb fights.
I suddenly wish I wasn't 30 years old. My family lived in the area,
He
so I could
still
just.
tells the story. Well, he grew up in Astoria and they're there too. And this was 70 years ago.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, this is one plant that we're not as heavily trying to manage it as we are the ivy, poison hemlock, and Himalayan blackberry, mainly because most of the wild cucumber that we have is on the cheap commonly park bank for us, and while we are trying to manage weeds on that site, we're also trying to figure out with the city when we can be ready to start doing some planting projects there. So until we're ready to start putting in plants and doing work to make the stream more habitable for fish, wildlife, and people, we're not doing as much weed management work to get the ground ready just yet.
So you said that one of the herbicides you use is rodeo?
Yes.
Where do you get that?
So we get rodeo from a couple of different places. Our main supplier is Wilco down in Salem, but I believe there are a couple of other suppliers here. You might be able to get it at one of the farm and feed supply stores, or you might be able to order it online. And if you're interested, you can leave your name and number with me, and I can email you some resources for that. It's
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned with the milkweed, or excuse me, with the nightshade, to, when you cut it down, to pick up every little piece because it'll reroot itself.
Yeah.
I've heard that's true about blackberry also.
So I've heard that about blackberry too. My understanding is that doesn't happen. Once you cut blackberry down, as long as it's severed from the mother root, it should die and biodegrade back into the ground. I think that's more common with plants like nightshade, which grow along rhizomes, just because since they have separate rootlets, they can survive more readily. Ivy is another plant that I've heard can do that as well, but I don't know enough to say yes or no to that question. My understanding is, and typically what we'll do is we'll say, City of St. Helens, because we did an ivy project with them, here's a giant pile of ivy, please come pick it up. We're gonna leave it at the edge of the park outside of the area we pulled it in. Yeah, generally speaking, you want to get rid of, I would just say get rid of weeds entirely. Never assume that you can leave them on site because there are some plants. I did have a specimen for yellow archangel, but unfortunately the yellow archangel fried on my porch in the heat. So we're going to talk about yellow archangel without a physical example to look at, but that's another plant where people accidentally spread it because since it's a mint family, it has the ability to really root itself and establish itself. So some people would pull it and then they leave it in the compost pile, or they put it in the green waste, and then all of a sudden the problem just spread, got really bad. And yellow archangel, again, I'm surprised my porch fried my yellow archangel. I wish it had, but that's another plant we're trying to watch out for and monitor on our sites because it is very difficult to eradicate. You can hand pull it, but you really either have to hand pull it entirely or you have to spray it. Like if you try to weed whack it, you'll spread the plant and make it even worse because it'll be sending little bits everywhere. And unfortunately, if you leave behind any rootlets as well, there's always going to be that chance that they come back. And they have seeds as well, which can last for a really long time too. So I will certainly try to verify the blackberry question because I want to be able to say yes or no, but my assumption is because it grows via canes rather than underground stems, it's probably fine to just cut it down and let it break back into the soil.
Yeah, my husband regularly, I just make piles and he mows over it and it doesn't come back.
We don't have it all over.
Well, I used to not anymore.
we put a lot of work into not letting it get into the compost pile or not letting it go out with the yard debris. We always gotta burn it, because we don't want it, you know, a neighbor's house or whatever.
Yeah, blackberries, unfortunately, it's gonna keep a lot of habitat restorationists in business for many years to come. And, you know, I do think it's fantastic though that both of you are trying to control the blackberry on your property sites. And if you ever have questions about, or any idea, or if you want any ideas, I'd love to be a resource for you because I'm constantly dancing the dance of controlling blackberry on my project sites. And then,
Is this?
yes, these are the same plants. And can I see your comfrey leaf actually? So
Feel free.
comfrey,
Here's the flower.
I'm so glad you brought this because, you know, I recently found comfrey on our North Scappoose Creek project site where we did a large wood installation and restoration project.
Oh, so we're just down the way from their cafe,
You were just downstream from it.
so it must have washed in at one time.
That's how we got a lot of ours when the floods came.
That's where the
Yeah.
Japanese knotweed came from.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the mustard came from too, that we didn't have for years and years.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why if we could get access to some of these headwater sites, I'd love to do, and I know the Soil and Water District would probably want to join me, and I just love to do a lot of exploration to see what weeds are up there and what type of control work we could do as well. But this is comfrey. It's also called knitbone. You can recognize it because it gets very big. It has these beautiful broad leaves that are a little bit like sandpaper, and it has these curled flower heads that have bright purple flowers. It's a medicinal plant, and it's also a plant that's cultivated in gardens. So based on where you guys are on the creek, I suspect there's someone who's either growing it in their garden box, or it could have escaped and grown close to the creek, and whenever the water comes in, it unfortunately washes these plants downstream. You know, this is not a plant that's considered invasive, but it's just a good example of how some plants that are garden plants can potentially become invasive problems because they have the growth habits or they have the ability to grow in different areas, and unfortunately they become invasive. We only have the one plant on North Scappoose Creek downstream, but you guys have it as well, so it sounds like this might be a plant that if we can maybe try to look at least monitoring it to make sure it doesn't spread, but that's the best advice I have right now in this minute, because I don't think there's any funding right now to go after unfortunately. But the nice thing about comfrey root is that it is supposed to be good for the soil, so I'd be curious to see what other plants might come up as a result of the comfrey. Thank you for bringing this.
You can have it if you want it.
Oh,
Feel
great.
free.
Oh,
I have plenty.
oh, great, thank you. I get a gift, this is fantastic. All right, well, we have about 15 more minutes, so I'd love to answer any other questions or give people a chance to come up here and look at
see
some
the
of the
materials
brochures.
I'd like to look at.
Yeah, I just want to say, everyone, you know, thank you so much for coming to this.
Well, thank you for doing this too.
Yeah, I just would love to honor my teachers and say thank you to the Soil and Water Conservation District for helping with producing the materials and also offering to help with the presentation, and to Chip Green, for whose presentation helped structure this presentation. So
Thanks.
we'll try to do more of this in the future, hopefully with some native plants, so I can just be all jazzy and show you some beautiful
You
native
came up
plants.
with what's her name from the Soil and Conservation.
Amber.
Amber. I am having the hardest time remembering her name.
That's okay.
I'm terrible with names, so.
Don't feel bad. I'm still that person where if I see someone like, hi, my name's Emily, I'm like, I know, we've had class for years in a row. But yeah, please come up and feel free to take a look at the plants. You're welcome to take any brochures that you want, and